Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about why Vladimir Putin wants Lula and Xi Jinping to broker a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and click on the notification bell so you don't miss any news. A few days ago, at the beginning of this month of July, to the surprise and indignation of many, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, a few days after receiving the rotating presidency of the European Council, visited Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, marking the first visit by a European leader to Russia since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Practically all European leaders issued messages of repudiation, distancing Orbán from Europe as an organization, emphasizing that Orbán was visiting Russia exclusively as Hungarian Prime Minister and not as rotating President of the European Council. But that did not stop Putin from declaring, on several occasions in his speeches, that he was receiving the President of the European Council there in the Kremlin, which only served to further increase the indignation in Europe. According to Orbán, the purpose of his visit was to pave the way for peace in Ukraine, with the two meeting behind closed doors for several hours to discuss an agenda whose content was not disclosed to the public. After visiting Russia, Orbán went to China to meet with Xi Jinping, with the Hungarian Prime Minister saying that it was a continuation of his trip that, according to him, aims to build peace. But at no time did Orbán give details about the peace proposals that he allegedly discussed with Putin and Xi Jinping. According to some European newspapers, shortly after leaving Russia, Orbán wrote a letter to the European Council, in which he gave some details about his meeting with Putin, highlighting the Russian leader's peace plan for Ukraine. According to journalists who had access to the letter, Orbán said that Putin is confident that time is on Russia's side, not Ukraine's, and that is why Putin seemed, in Orbán's eyes, genuinely surprised that Ukraine would not accept an immediate ceasefire. And regarding the ceasefire itself, Orbán said that Putin wants the agreement to be brokered by Brazilian President Lula da Silva and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. But why does Putin insist that the ceasefire be brokered by the Brazilian president and the Chinese leader? The ceasefire in Ukraine is a very complex and delicate issue, with many supporters and opponents. In a war, it is clear that the end of hostilities, even if temporary through a ceasefire, is always very welcome, providing time and the means and resources to support civilians and to evacuate those closest to the fighting to the rear. However, a ceasefire is also very useful for armies in combat, providing a pause in battles that can be used by commanders to rotate soldiers to the front line, reinforce positions, and adjust and regulate logistics, all with the aim of preparing forces for the resumption of fighting. And this is precisely what Ukraine fears is Putin's real objective when he talks about a ceasefire. For Ukrainians, a ceasefire now will only benefit Russia, as it will allow Putin to rotate units that, according to various sources, have been fighting virtually non-stop since February 2022 and, most importantly, it will allow Putin to adjust his logistics, always a very sensitive point for the Russian army. In addition to all this, Ukrainians fear that, with the ceasefire, Putin will have the opportunity to bring to the front line the more than 200,000 new fighters who, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense itself, are now being trained in Russia. According to Vladimir Putin himself, a ceasefire cannot, under any circumstances, involve the withdrawal of Russian invasion forces from their current positions inside Ukraine. In other words, Putin wants a pause in the fighting, but at the same time, he wants to keep all the areas he currently occupies. Which means that if Ukraine's fears are real, and if Putin's purpose in this pause in the fighting is only to prepare for a new attack, this new attack, with redoubled and rested Russian forces, will come from positions that are tremendously disadvantageous for the Ukrainians. And this is precisely where Putin's interest in Lula and Xi Jinping arises. According to the letter written by Orbán, Putin knows that Lula and Xi Jinping advocate a ceasefire that guarantees Russia possession of the Ukrainian regions already occupied. Unlike Ukraine's allies, who do not want to talk about a ceasefire until Putin leaves at least Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. In this sense, Lula and Xi Jinping would act as Putin's intermediaries, defending, before the international community, an immediate ceasefire agreement in which Russia would maintain possession of the regions it already occupies, which, according to Ukraine, is nothing more than the aforementioned plan for Putin to strengthen his positions and prepare to attack again in a few months. Putin, by directly mentioning Lula and Xi Jinping as the intermediary of this ceasefire, implies that Russia has already negotiated, or, at least, advanced the matter with the governments of Brazil and China. Could Lula be in secret negotiations with the Kremlin to negotiate the ceasefire that Putin so desires? And if that is the case, what will be the reaction of Western allies, led by the United States and the main European powers, to the role allegedly played by Brazil in facilitating the resumption of war after a ceasefire favorable to the Russians? The truth, what we really know, is that a ceasefire along the lines advocated by Putin and described here, is of no interest to Ukraine. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bells so you don't miss any news.